page 507 in the Church Bibles, and we're going to read chapters 8 to 10. That same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, which he had devised against the Jews. Then the king extended the gold scepter to Esther, and she arose and stood before him.
"If it pleases the king,"
she said,
"and if he regards me with favor and thinks it is the right thing to do, and if he is pleased with me, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, devised and wrote to destroy all the Jews in all the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family?"
King Xerxes replied to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew,
Because Haman attacked the Jews, I have given his estate to Esther, and they have impaled him on the pole he set up. Now, write another decree in the king's name on behalf of the Jews, as seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked.
At once the royal secretaries were summoned. On the 23rd day of the 3rd month, the month of Sivan, they wrote out all Mordecai's orders to the Jews and to the satraps, governors, and nobles of the 127 provinces stretching from India to Cush. These orders were written in the script of each province and the language of each people, and also to the Jews in their own script and language. Mordecai wrote in the name of King Xerxes, sealed the dispatches with the king's signet ring, and sent them by mounted couriers who rode fast horses especially bred for the king. The king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, annihilate the armed men of any nationality or province who might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. The day appointed for the Jews to do this in all the provinces of King Xerxes was the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers riding the royal horses went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. When Mordecai left the king's presence, he was wearing royal garments of blue and white, a large crown of gold and a purple robe of fine linen, and the city of Susa held a joyous celebration. For the Jews, it was a time of happiness and joy, gladness and honor. In every province and in every city to which the edict of the king came, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with feasting and celebrating. And many people of other nationalities became Jews because fear of the Jews had seized them. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but now the tables were turned, and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities in all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those determined to destroy them. No one could stand against them, because the people of all other nationalities were afraid of them. And all the nobles of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the king's administrators helped the Jews, because fear of Mordecai had seized them. Mordecai was prominent in the palace. His reputation spread throughout the provinces, and he became more and more powerful. The Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. in the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. They also killed Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Poratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmashata, Arisai, Aridai, and Vaisatha, the 10 sons of Haman of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. But they did not lay their hands on the plunder. The number of those killed in the citadel of Susa was reported to the king that same day. The king said to Queen Esther,
The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman in the citadel of Susa. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request? It will also be granted.
If it pleases the king,
Esther answered,
give the Jews in Susa permission to carry out this day's edict tomorrow also, and let Haman's 10 sons be impaled on poles.
So the king commanded that this be done. An edict was issued in Susa, and they impaled the 10 sons of Haman. The Jews in Susa came together on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they put to death in Susa 300 men, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Meanwhile, the remainder of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also assembled to protect themselves and get relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of them, but did not lay their hands on the plunder. This happened on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. The Jews in Susa, however, had assembled on the 13th and 14th, and then on the 15th they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. That is why rural Jews, those living in villages, observe the 14th month of the month of Adar as a day of joy and feasting, a day for giving presents to each other. Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far, that they should celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned to joy and their mourning into a day of celebration. He wrote to them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews agreed to continue the celebration they had begun, doing what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them and had cast the pur, that is the lot, for their ruin and destruction. But when the plot came to the king's attention, he issued written orders that the evil scheme Haman had devised against the Jews should come back onto his own head, and that he and his sons should be impaled on poles. Therefore, these days were called Purim, from the word pure. Because of everything written in this letter, and because of what they had seen and what had happened to them, the Jews took it on themselves to establish the custom that they and their descendants and all who join them should without fail observe these 2 days every year in the way prescribed and at the time appointed. These days should be remembered and observed in every generation by every family and in every province and in every city. And these days of Purim should never fail to be celebrated by the Jews, nor should the memory of these days die out among their descendants. So Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, along with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter concerning Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews in the 127 provinces of Xerxes' kingdom, words of goodwill and assurance, to establish these days of Purim at their designated times, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had decreed for them, and as they had established for themselves and their descendants in regard to their times of fasting and lamentation. Esther's decree confirmed these regulations about Purim, and it was written down in the records. King Xerxes imposed tribute throughout the empire to its distant shores, and all his acts of power and might, together with a full account of the greatness of Mordecai, whom the king had promoted, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of the Media and Persia? Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews, because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews.
Thanks, Kirsten, and thanks, readers. Thanks, Nigel. Really good to meet you if you weren't at the weekend. Great that you're here. And just to say thank you very much to all of you for having me at the weekend. You're a lovely group to hang out with, and it was genuinely refreshing and encouraging for me to be with you, so thank you very much. I don't know if any of you are into Lord of the Rings. Any Lord of the Rings people here? Well, I'm not. Sorry, that's not where this is going. It goes back to a guy called Mark at school. I remember his name, and he'd walk around with the thickest book that I'd ever seen in my life. I don't know, would it have been The Hobbit or something like that? I made a mental note to keep away from that stuff because I like my entertainment to be concise, and The Lord of the Rings is never concise. My brother took me to see The Return of the King at the cinema. I managed to stay awake, mainly, follow the plot, mainly. And at the end of the final battle scene, I got quite excited. I thought, this has been a bit of an endurance test, but, we're almost there. Started to gather up the remains of the popcorn. But the battle scene wasn't the end. And the next scene wasn't the end either, and nor was the one after that. And it was a total tease, because if you know it, every of those scenes has the fade out and the big music, and yet the thing just goes on and on and on. The Return of the King is the movie that keeps on giving because it never ends. And the point is, you may feel Esther is a bit like that. The big baddie's already hanging. Time for the credits to roll. And did you feel, as it was read, it's a bit sort of repetitious and admin-y, and all these letters and administration going on and on and on. Well, this is the main practical application for the people of God. So even though it's admin, don't zone out. Remember, we've called this one, because that's the thing. How good is your memory, I wonder? How good is your memory for the things that God's done for you? It is the secret to the Christian life, Remember. First then, the great reversal is fully accomplished. I think we're wired to love it when the tables are turned, so defeat looms, the opposition look invincible, and somehow the great reversal is accomplished by Liverpool or whoever. Just seems to be a plot line written into the fabric of the universe, which is not surprising, because it's a plot line written into the workings of the God who runs the universe. Chapter 8, verse 2, there on page 506. The king took off his signet ring, which he'd reclaimed from Haman, presented it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. Happy ending time? Well, what you need to know if you weren't here, you probably picked it up because it all got repeated in our reading. Haman is the big bad guy. He's dead, but his law to have all of the Jews annihilated on a certain date is still the law. The dreaded day still looms. So Esther begs the king for the law to be revoked. And as ever, he's amenable but confused. 8 verse 7. King Xerxes replied to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, because Haman attacked the Jews, I have given his estate to Esther, and they've impaled him on the pole he set up. Now write another decree in the king's name on behalf of the Jews, as seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring. In other words, you guys sort it out, Esther and Mordecai. Get the legal brains together. See what the guys can come up with, and I'll sign on the dotted line, says the king. They can't revoke Haman's original order, law of the Medes and Persians, but they can come up with another edict of their own. And Mordecai's new edict, it mainly involves 2 computer keys. So Control-C and Control-V. Is that copy and paste? I mentioned at the weekend, I was a lawyer. I don't know if any of you are lawyers. When I was a young lawyer, all you needed to know was basically where those two keys are on the keyboard, because all you did was copy and paste documents that had already been written, and then you would just write in the new person's details. There might have been a bit more than that since I left the profession, I don't know. But verses 9 to 14 of chapter 8 are mainly a cut and paste of Haman's edict, except in reverse. And it's really interesting. You could have chapter 3 in front of you with chapter 8, hold them up together and look at the parallel language. So royal secretaries were summoned in chapter 3. Here in chapter 8, the royal secretaries are summoned. Haman ordered. Here Mordecai ordered, 8 verse 9. It went to all the provinces. Again, all the provinces. Chapter 3 was sealed with the king's signet ring. Again, sealed with the king's ring. 8 verse 11 is the key similarity and difference. 8 verse 11, the king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate the armed men of any nationality or province who might attack them or their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. The day appointed for the Jews to do this in all the provinces of King Xerxes was the 13th day of the 12th month, same day. So the day is coming when Haman's evil edict will kick in. Haman's armed forces will be ruthless. The women and children will be targeted. And the Jews have been given the right to defend themselves on that dreaded day. Did you notice the reaction just at the passing of the edict? Verse 15 of chapter 8. When Mordecai left the king's presence, he was wearing royal garments of blue and white, a large crown of gold, and a purple robe of fine linen. And the city of Susa held a joyous celebration. Woohoo! There's a scene in the movie Lincoln where the vote is passed for the 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, abolishing slavery. And there's this scene of sheer joy as the senators start throwing their hats in the air, dancing around the building. All that happened was a law was passed. No one's life actually changed at that moment. And yet the edict changed everything. It's the same here. Verse 16 of chapter 8, the Jews who had previously mourned, fasted, wept, and wailed, they'd done 4 things. Well, here it's 4 different things with the great reversal. 4:16, happiness, joy, gladness, honor. And in the provinces, instead of Jews laying low, like Mordecai and Esther did at the start of the book, other people are becoming them. End of chapter 8. Whether that was a genuine conversion or they could just see which way the wind was blowing, you want to be on the side of the Jews now. Well, the day arrives, 9 verse 1. Some dates go down in infamy, don't they? Just the date. So September the 11th, 2001. You know immediately what I'm talking about. All I've done is said a date. The 13th day of the 12th month should be a day of infamy for the Jews. But by the end of 9 verse 1, the great reversal had occurred. They had the upper hand now. Verse 5 elaborates, the Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, including the sons of Haman, verse 9 and 10, who get impaled, 9 verse 13. 9 verse 16, meanwhile the remainder of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also assembled to protect themselves and get relief for their enemies. They killed 75,000 of them, but didn't lay their hands on the plunder. Now, we saw at the weekend that Esther is in many ways a light-hearted book. We even had booing and cheering. If you missed the weekend, you missed booing and cheering. That's deemed the appropriate tone for this. So we may be shocked at the end, all this killing. Well, the edict and the detail make clear they only act in self-defense, only against the armies who attack them, and them not taking the plunder. That's repeated verse 15 and 16. Shows that it was a holy war in that sense. They were only acting to protect themselves. And there was an opportunity to join the Jews. That sheer number of deaths mentioned there partly just reminds us how great the threat was across what was the biggest empire the world to this date has ever known by percentage of global population who were in the Persian Empire. It was the biggest ever. Murderers are about to attack all Jews in all of those places, women and children included. Haman and his sons, they were not Boy Scouts. They were genocidal. And stringing up those ringleaders, well, that's a way of very publicly saying that evil lost today. 9 verse 17 is VE Day. This happened on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. It's the Arsenal parade all over again. We should have done this one last week. You had a visual aid right outside the door here. Well, how are we getting to know God better through this? I think we can say from Esther that the hidden hand of the Lord has quite a particular artistic style. So the old preacher Charles Spurgeon said it's a bit like looking at a picture, and even though the artist's name isn't written at the bottom of the portrait, the brush strokes are so familiar, you know exactly who crafted this piece. So, enemies who are allowed to do their worst, seemingly invincible, but then a humbling of the proud, a raising up of a representative from nowhere who would plead before the Almighty, a decree of death trumped by a decree of life, rescue and judgment happening alongside each other. Even before you get to Jesus, these are the brushstrokes the people of God knew from the Lord, Yahweh, of old. There's even a tortured device that becomes an instrument of salvation. Is that me reading a bit too much in? Well, you're allowed to think that, but not if you think it because you think God couldn't be in charge of that level of detail. There's a delay before final rescue and people turning in that delay. We live in a time like that, delivered, waiting for final deliverance, praying that others will turn, and a leader at the end who rules, who's loved by the people because he only ever works and acts for his people's good. Remind you of anyone? This is a Yahweh special. It's his signature style. This is just the way you would expect the covenant Lord to work. And the point of noticing those familiar brushstrokes is not so you win the quiz for how many subtle references to Jesus in the gospel can you find in Esther. It's to help you when life feels a bit exilish, when everything against God looks strong, when others seem to decree the script. We won't be too fazed because we'll remember turning the tables is his speciality. We remember that he does some of his best work in the weakness and the darkness. Have you found that out in your own life yet? When there's a delay before our final rescue, and when all you feel like doing is lamenting and weeping, this pattern reminds us that for God's people, the story arc always ends in joy and gladness. So I hope and pray that hearing something a bit similar to our big rescue story will leave us thanking God for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever, even during the seasons when he feels less visible and tangible. We have blessings to count. Aren't we part of the most amazing turnaround in fortunes that there's ever been. You were under a decree of death. You had a seemingly invincible enemy in Satan and his forces of sin that were a shadow over your entire life and destiny. But a leader was raised up for you to turn the tables. Do you know, to my shame, I get so used to salvation and forgetting the story that Nigel was reminding us about earlier. Hell loomed for me, and now heaven beckons to welcome you and me into a feast of celebration. How wonderful. What a story. I wonder if it's your personal story yet. The joy of this could be yours today. Join the community of the rescued. That's what we are, as people joined them back then in the day. And that brings us to this main practical application, the main take home for the ordinary people of God from the book of Esther is to remember. 9 verse 17, this happened on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. The Jews in Susa, however, assembled on the 13th and 14th, and then on the 15th they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. The verses after that, they are quite admin-y and diary focused, but it's fun admin. It's to do with setting up this festival of Purim, verse 20, verse 21, that they should celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, the month when their sorrow was turned into joy, and mourning into a celebration. He wrote to them to observe these days. And there's a going back and forward. Mordecai writes to them about observing, and then the Jews in verse 23, they write back and say they accept that they'll do this every year. 9 verse 27, they firmly bind themselves to celebrate this in every generation. And then one more letter from Esther confirming the procedure for Purim. It all turns out to be quite a bureaucratic operation. But the aim, verse 28, 9 verse 28, these days should be remembered and observed in every generation by every family, in every province, in every city. And these days of Purim should never fail to be celebrated by the Jews, nor should the memory of these days die out among their descendants. See, it's a Remembrance Day kind of thing, but it's more like VE Day. It's street party time, Purim. And sure enough, Purim's something that lots of Jewish people continue to observe on those same days. It's usually in the middle of March. It's apparently a time of families gathering, food. They retell the story of Esther. And I take it that that's why this history book, Esther, is crafted the way it is. It's a true story written in a way that emphasizes the memorable and the fun, because it being memorable is the point. The story isn't over until provision is made for the rescue story to be remembered. And that's another sign that the covenant Lord is behind this, because when God acts in big ways, he asks his people to remember Passover. Striking when you read back the detail in Exodus, there's more word count on how they should remember the Passover than there is in detail of what actually happened that night. Suggestion is they won't naturally remember, and history has borne that out. God's people are often better forgetters than rememberers. What Mordecai, now passionate that this rescue and the God that it shouts of should keep being retold. That's the purpose of the book of Esther. Why? Well, because middle of the story syndrome can weigh us down. Even for them, verse 28 suggests they're still going to be scattered. They'll still have problems with foreign kings. Most of the time, through most of history, most of God's people are not at home with the Lord. We're still in exile. And the thing that will keep us going, remembering the Lord, remembering his interventions. If only we can nail remembering, that will be the thing that keeps us going in the Christian life. You know, back in Deuteronomy, remembering what the Lord had done for them was directly linked with not fearing, not bowing, not trusting other powers. And back then, remembering was directly linked with not being proud or starting to think, we've done this. No, we're defined as the community of the rescued. Remembering is directly linked to not grumbling and saying things like, give thanks to the Lord for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. Remember what precisely? 9 verse 22, relief with the Lord, sorrow to joy, mourning into a celebration. In other words, remember that with the Lord, relief and deliverance always arise in the end. We'll only keep standing firm and standing out and being bold if we stay rememberers. No obligation to observe Purim for Christians, just as there's no obligation to observe the other festivals of the Old Testament, not because they're not part of our heritage. Passover, Esther, the shadows of our rescue story, which we are told to remember. Jesus, the great act of relief and deliverance just before he goes to the cross as he breaks bread. Do this in remembrance of me. You know, I think the book ends this way because the big crisis moments are not something we can engineer, but we can engineer cultivating a way of life that says we're people with a better story. And cultivating this, it will mean diaries and dates and commitments. We've got the building blocks for those things. Annually, we've got our festivals, Christmas and Easter. The government still kindly gives us some days off to be rememberers. The songs we sing at church, thanks to the guys who've served us with the music. Monthly, weekly, daily. What rhythms have you built in to make you a rememberer? You know, being rememberers together, that's in huge part what church life is all about. And you're clearly committed to it because you're here. But I find it's easy to be blasé about just another Sunday, just another small group. Not just another anything, actually. We're in exile. We're in a battle. It's easy to think that we'll focus on work or whatever, and church will always be there. But the default in exile is we'll forget. Life makes us grumble. Maybe the goodies of Persia make us forget. But there's more than the good life in exile. There's home with the Lord, and I want to battle to be a rememberer until I get there. And it doesn't have to be boring. Purim was a remembering with joy. It's a celebration. We express joy differently with our different temperaments and cultures. Paul talks about being sorrowful yet always rejoicing. It's a hard fought for joy sometimes. But permission to be glad as you reflect on your turnaround of fortunes. I wonder if you know people whose memory of the gospel has faded. It can happen really gradually, and it's really sad. And I wonder on the flip side if you know people who've trusted him through hostility and deep pain of life in a world that feels far from God. Some of you will be people in this church family who've trusted God in the pit. Think of folks in our church family, Basil, who was amazingly trusting of the Lord when he was dying of cancer at the age of 39. As were Sam and Fran when they lost their little baby daughter, Libby. Mina and Elizabeth, they're mission partners of ours in the Middle East. I mentioned them yesterday. A couple of years ago, they got betrayed to the government, and a member of their team was murdered, their mission team. And they sent us a video message. It was really moving how deeply they felt that wound. and yet still give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. You know, I'm tempted to think that people like that are heroes. They would say they're not heroes, but they are good examples of the difference it makes in the dark days when you've remembered the Lord on the ordinary days. The difference on the dark days when you've cultivated remembering on the ordinary days. This Purim, it's a picture for us of a better day, a better celebration, a feast for the people of God. It's a picture of a leader who only ever makes orders for his people's good. We still live in the middle of our deliverance story, but the end of the script has been written for us. And you can be sure it will be another Yahweh special. Relief from enemies, mourning into a celebration, days of feasting and joy. Makes you want to say, come, Lord Jesus, doesn't it? Come really soon, please, Lord Jesus. Amen.